Okay, so we are going to look at John chapter 2. This is the story of the wedding at Cana. And it's kind of an interesting follow-up because the last couple weeks we've looked at, kind of both the huge side of Christ as rule of the universe. Then we looked at kind of Christ's humility and joining humanity in all of us. And then these early John chapters, I think, are a really neat way to look at, okay, what does it look like to actually disciple? What does it look like to apprentice ourselves to actually following this Jesus? So chapter 2 is basically one of the first times Jesus' disciples get to see him in action. The kind of context on this is we obviously have that beautiful start to John with that poem about, in the beginning was the Word. And then we kind of we get to see John doing his thing, and then Jesus pretty quickly starts gathering his disciples. And there's just two phrases that I think are really important kind of leading into this story. And one is Jesus first, he said, there's two disciples of John's are following him. And he says, well, where are you staying? What are you teaching about? And he says, come and see. I'll show you where I'm staying. And then those words are repeated again when one of those two that meets originally with him comes and tells his brother. And he says, hey, I think we found the Messiah because John pointed us to this guy. And he's like, really? He's like, yeah, just come and see. You'll see. Right? And to me, I still think that's one of the most beautiful invitations, what it looks like to invite people into kind of the Christian family, the Christian story, right? Like, we've talked a lot historically. Why don't you just come and see? It's a tough sell still, because people don't want to come and see, but, I think they do well when they do. So that's part of it. The very last words at the end of chapter 1 are one of these new disciples does come and see. And then he comes to Jesus, and Jesus is like, here's Nathaniel. This guy does not BS, right? Here's an Israelite who tells the truth. And he's like, how do you know me? He's like, well, I saw you under the fig tree or the olive tree, whatever it is. Oh, you must be the Son of God. And he's like, that makes you believe? He's like, you're going to see a lot mightier works than these. Those are like the last words we hear of Jesus going into this story. So a lot of people think when this story starts and says, so 3 days later, a lot of people think this is just 3 days after that encounter. And so we're jumping right in the middle of the story in some ways. But it kind of shows you how Jesus is starting to work with these guys. So again, in this story, it's probably before there are 12 picked out disciples. There's just some kind of dudes hanging around with Jesus, seeing what he's about at this point. And this is kind of a neat story, I think, showing us, again, what Jesus is about. So on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and these new disciples were also invited to the celebration. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother said to him, they don't have any wine. And Jesus replied, woman, what does that have to do with me? My time hasn't come yet. His mother told the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby were 6 stone water jars used for the Jewish cleansing ritual, each able to hold about 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them to the brim. And then he told them, now draw some from them and take it to the head waiter. And they did. The head waiter tasted the water that had become wine. He didn't know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And the head waiter called the groom and said, everyone serves the good wine first, and they bring out the second-rate wine only when the guests are drinking freely. You kept the good wine till now. This was the first miraculous sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, Jesus, his mother, his brothers, and disciples went down to Capernaum and stayed for a few days. So one of the important things to remember as we're reading John always is these, it says, miraculous signs in this one. This is one of John's favorite ways to talk about miracles. He doesn't include nearly as many miracle stories as some of the other Gospels do. And he always points to them as signs. He's saying this is something that reveals kind of what Jesus is doing. And a lot of people connect to these with, in John 5, Jesus tells the Pharisees, like, who do you think you are? And he says, I'm only doing the work that I see and that God has for me. And so a lot of people think that if you look through, the language is similar enough. So what are the signs? They are Jesus showing what kind of things are God's will and his work. So the signs are always very specifically pointing to some aspect of God. And that's why John picked them out. Like, okay, here's something that highlights really well this thing God was all about, this thing Jesus was all about. So the question for us is, okay, in this first miracle, this first sign, what is it that Jesus is wanting us to get, or John wants to make sure we pick up on from Jesus' life? And so the first probably sign pointing to in this that his original readers, Jewish people, would have thought of was immediately this idea of abundance, almost superabundance that always goes with kind of the new creation. If you read about some of the stories in Isaiah, some of the other prophetic texts, they're almost a little silly in how abundant things are, right? There's like that great passage of the reapers are going to overcome the sowers. This harvest is so wonderful, they're going to run into each other because they just can't get seeds in the ground fast enough, right? And there's a lot of images like this. It's superabundance. The fact that there's going to be just enough and then some proves that God is present and things have been made right again. And so the first time when you see this act of abundance, this act of generosity on Jesus' part, this is kind of where their minds are going to go. Like, hey, if this is a sign, maybe God is here. Maybe this is a hint that the kingdom is near, which is another way that Jesus taught a lot. The kingdom of God is near you. And in John, he likes these signs to point towards that. And so the story, as I was saying, emphasizes not necessarily power, although obviously it's a neat magic trick, right? Snaps his fingers, but that's not really the point. It's not emphasizing that Jesus is powerful, although he is. It's emphasizing Jesus is generous, right? He goes a little above and beyond what is necessary for this great, for this thing. He could have probably gotten a couple of bottles of wine and maybe would have cruised through the rest of this thing, right? And he makes, 120, 180 gallons of the good stuff for this party, so the party can continue. And so there's the generosity. It's a very similar way of being told when he feeds the 5,000 as well. Like, God can make there be enough. But it's not this like minimalist, bare minimum enough. God enjoys and desires abundance. And not just abundance. The story actually emphasizes not that there's a ton of wine all of a sudden, even though that's in there. Like, what's the wine, or what's the guy in charge saying, right? It was good stuff. God makes the good stuff to keep the party going, right? And I just think it's one of those things that we can look past too quickly, right? That God actually cares about the quality. Dare I say go far, God actually has taste. He doesn't just want something there. He doesn't want the, half-assed versions of things we often offer him. He deserves the good stuff. He has good taste. He's worthy of the best because he gives the best. And so I think, this kind of austere, kind of ascetic idea that has kind of haunted Christianity. Does it have a place? Yes. We can very much get overly attached to blame and comfort in those things. Absolutely. But that's the point is of austerity, the point of denying ourselves, fasting, sort of things, to remind us that God is enough. That is there. It's not this inherent dislike of food and drink and celebrating. And I just think we need to remember that sometimes, because that is so many people's image of God, right? And so what's the first thing Jesus points out to his disciples? What's Jesus going to get in trouble from the religious types most of his career? He likes to party, and he likes to party with the wrong people, right? Those are kind of the two big ones. But he just seems to have a little too much fun to be a good religious guy, right? Is that what we're known for? Is that what Jesus' followers are known for? Just the quality and the fun? We need to change that. He deserves the best. There's something just celebratory always in describing the new kingdom, which Jesus is, of course, arguing is here. It's among us. Just kind of a final point on the idea of abundance, because this is a passage that sometimes gets picked up, although with, funky thoughts on what he was actually making. It couldn't have been wine, right? Christians don't drink, apparently. But this is a passage that gets pulled out of saying, look, Jesus can provide enough. He can be abundance. Therefore, he wants you to be happy and have a jet and a gold chain or whatever, right? There is this, I don't know, just modern, kind of just, I think it's disgusting, view that God wants us to be happy and comfortable. No one preaching to the choir on this one. But it's really gross to me with the amount of work Jesus puts into celebrating with people and the idea that God is here and there's enough. He's asking us to enjoy the simplicity because the abundance is around us if we see it. We don't always need more. The joy here in this celebration comes from being with a bunch of people, right? He didn't send them off with their individual bottles of wine so they could feel abundant on their own. And you see that almost every time. Like, no, this was a communal celebration. This was the epitome of, community life for a bunch of poor peasants. They got together to harvest. And when someone was getting married, this was one of the biggest events in the community's life. Everyone was there in this little village, right? We were all together celebrating this new couple, sending them off, affirming life together in some ways. And Jesus blesses that. He says, yes, we should be celebrating. We should be having a good time with these things. It's not this idea of we get to go off and have all of our wants met in some silly, ridiculous ways, right? And so it just made me mad reading that people are reading this passage that way. Considering as well, there's some kind of nods in Jesus' interaction with his mom, for instance, which I'll talk about in a second. My day isn't here yet. What's the day? It's not superabundance and comfort. It is finding the kingdom through death, right? And so I think holding those two pieces can be a little tricky at times, that God does love goodness and celebration, but he doesn't love kind of the cheap, selfish version that we often put on him, right? He wants the real thing, the good stuff, which is a celebration of a victory over death, over individuality, over kind of the cheap version, which we want to turn into stuff, when he wants to offer community and blessedness. A lot of people look at this passage and like, what is going on with Mary, who's not named, interestingly. In the Gospel of John, most people think that probably what this is a hint for is the fact that Mary only shows up 2 times in this Gospel. Here, and at the foot of the cross. He also, in both of those, kind of connects the two of them, right? When's the end of their own time we're going to see her? Is this, he says, my day is not here yet, to her. Some people have looked at this and say, oh, he's obviously being really rude. It's probably not as bad as it sounds to us, like, woman, like that. It was a very normal term. You hear him say that to Mary, and endearing in a lot of ways, like at the cross, like, woman, what's wrong? What are you looking for? So it doesn't have quite the sting it does in English, but it's also, some people have tried to turn it into like, it's a pet name for his mom. Isn't he being sweet? Like, that's not really happening here either. Like, you just feel uncomfortable that Jesus isn't being quite as nice as you want him to be. And likely what that's coming from is just kind of a reminder for her that there is some distancing. Like, I'm not just your son right now. Like, I'm stepping into a bigger role. And John particularly points out a lot of the time that Jesus can't really be forced to do things. And so that's probably in the story. It's also likely she's not actually telling him to do something, which is somehow be like, hey, son, would you fix this, please? If you look at it, she's actually just says, hey, they're out of wine. Why? Because she knows who Jesus is. She knows he does help in things, but he kind of points out to her, like, it's not my day yet. We don't want to do this big thing. And what I like about her is she's like, okay, but I know you, and I know you like helping out. So rather than making this a big thing, because that's not what this is about, and I think there's a little bit of rebuke there, just making sure she knows this. The day isn't here. This is not what this is about. She still gives him an opportunity, right? She still keeps working, saying, hey, this sort of thing. Listen to him. I know my boy. He'll take care of this, right? He wants people to be able to celebrate. There's also something here that I think is important. Yeah, is there a lot of cultural shame around running out of wine? Yeah, there is. Are people starving? Is it really that urgent that the Son of God needs to come and do something? No. Which is encouraging to us, right? okay, those things that are a big embarrassment to me, those things that feel like a really big deal to me, but I feel a little embarrassed bringing this up to God or other people at church, whatever. Jesus is like, I can fix that. I do care, right? So there's some encouragement in that story. And so I was just thinking, there's actually a kind of a neat model of prayer in the way Mary handles this, right? She brings it up to him, points it out. He knows. But she brings it to his attention and makes sure he seizes it, right? And then when he's not willing to do it in the way she probably wanted, she backs down. And yet she continues to provide opportunity for God to work in this story. I don't know, just something that I was struck by. How much of the time do we give up when we don't get the answer we want from God? How much of the time do we just not let it keep going? And how much of the time do we throw a hissy fit if God won't do it our way, right? Mary sees this need, she brings it to God's attention, and she basically stays open to him doing it his way, because he does care. And she assumes that, which I think is important. The other kind of neat thing I wanted to point out in this story was the disciples, right? The signs show up a bunch of times in John, and a good chunk of the time, like we like to think like, oh, if a miracle happened, then people would change, or I would change, or I believe you. Well, God, if you do this, fine, I'll follow, right? John really likes highlighting the fact when a miracle happens, people come up with their own interpretations if they don't want to follow a lot of the time. But this very first one, it's not a big public miracle. The only people who are in on this thing are his family, the servants, right, who did some of the work, who probably were ignored, and, of course, the disciples. And we're told right there at the end that they see the miracle and they do the right thing with it. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. His disciples trusted in him. It was a first step of affirming this guy is worth following. Yeah, he's powerful, but he's also celebratory. We saw what he did there, and he didn't need to make a big show out of that. There's something really beautiful in that we miss a lot of the time, in our desire for influence or showiness, right? His disciples saw what God did, and they celebrated it, and they trusted. God is building something in them that they're going to need as the story goes on, right? So I just think it's a neat story. It's a simple first story. It's not big, it's not flashy, but it reminds us again of who God's character is. He cares about the little details. He sometimes wants to do it his own way, but he does want to celebrate. He believes in abundance. He believes in the goodness of the things we enjoy. He affirms those. He comes alongside and makes it better. But he expects us to trust based on that, right? Most of the other people there missed it. They enjoyed the wine. Just like there's people all around us and us most of the time, we miss, and we're perfectly willing to enjoy the good things we're given day in and day out, right? But we miss what was really significant about it. There's an opportunity to build trust, to remember again, this is the kind of thing God is all about. Celebrating, being together, affirming our daily lives, weddings, kids, worries, work. That's the place that God wants to be.